Morning, everybody. So, as Mark said, well, first of all, thank you, Mark, for the invitation. It's always lots of fun to be able to spend a bit of time at this event. It's funny, at some point we'll reminisce about just how far this file has evolved in the 4 or 5 years that we've been talking about this. It strikes me that it's evolved just a little bit. So as Mark said, you heard my title. So there's this thing at Health Canada called the Cannabis Legalization and Regulation Secretariat. $5 to anybody who guesses what we do at the office. It's an office that was created about 1.5 years ago, 2 years ago, and shortly after the government came to power, and in an effort to support the 3 lead ministers in delivering on their commitment to develop a new framework. So we were the shop that had the pleasure and the privilege of supporting Mark and Anne McClellan and the rest of the task force on their road trip and the development of their report. We're the group that has supported the government to put the legislation in place, the regulations that will follow, and frankly, the group that will evolve relatively quickly to become the regulatory operation at a point in time should Parliament approve the bill. So today, what I'm gonna try to do, and it's a lot to go over, but I will do my best to be coherent and quick. I'll try to give everybody a sense of where things stand right now, and I'm going to present it through a lens, as it were, of public health, and I'll explain exactly why we're doing that. That's not what I tried to do. Joyce, you okay if I do the CMA perspective? So I think they're going to work out the technological challenges, but maybe while they're doing that. So policy intent really matters when we start talking about cannabis legalization. And I will get to the nuts and bolts of what the system is going to look like and where we're at in terms of implementation. I'll try my best to walk everybody through all the major pieces of this undertaking that people tend to be interested in. But I want to start with the policy intent of the government, because I think it's really important to understand the kind of the rationale. And maybe the easiest way to do that is to juxtapose the Canadian approach a little bit with some approaches that you may be familiar with or perhaps less familiar with. So when the governor of Nevada talks about the state of Nevada's approach for legalizing cannabis, the policy intent is expressed entirely in terms of revenue generation. The goal of the state government is to generate revenue as a result of the regulation of cannabis. And then so everything that follows, all of the decisions around the particular characteristics of their regime flow in support of that policy interest. So the government of Canada has taken a significantly different approach and has defined the initiative largely using public health language. And so everything that then follows, whether it's the attributes of the legislation, the characteristics of the regulations, and everything that kind of surrounds it, exists to support a public health interest. And so I'll kind of try my best to deconstruct that a little bit. And the public health language is, nowhere is it more apparent or obvious than the task force report. And the task force report really kind of helped to define and set the stage for what this could look like. How do all the component pieces start to work together towards achieving public health interests? And really all of those are around minimizing health and social harms associated with the control of cannabis. So everyone close your eyes and imagine there's a slide that has a bunch of bar graphs, and it more or less makes the point that rates of use are high in Canada. Somewhere between 4 and 6 million Canadians use cannabis every year. And then next to that bar graph is another bar graph that shows the criminal justice system. And while we can certainly have a lively debate around enforcement and uneven enforcement across the country, but the reality is when you look at the numbers of people who over time and still now interact with the criminal justice system for things like cannabis possession, it's very, very high. So here we are. Can we go to the next slide? I don't want to press any buttons for fear of derailing everything. So there we go. See, I told you there were bar graphs. Okay, yeah, for sure. Really, the point of this slide is to say that relying exclusively on criminal prohibitions and criminal penalties has not had the deterrent effect that they were intended to have, and that they have not had they have not achieved the goal of protecting the public from associated health and social harms. So if we go to the next one. So let's talk about harms. It's interesting. I'm very aware that I'm making this presentation in the midst of an event that is entirely geared towards talking about therapeutic applications and has a decidedly kind of different there's a different conversation that's happening. So I want to start by acknowledging that, acknowledging the room and the need to have the conversation and encouraging inquiry with respect to the potential and real therapeutic applications of cannabis. And at the same time, acknowledge that as a fundamental tenet of the public health approach, we need to find a way in this country to encourage and have an honest, neutral, fact-based conversation about the health effects of cannabis. And right now, the space is it's highly emotional. It's in some ways too influenced by mythology on either ends of the spectrum. And so really, finding a way to carve out a room to talk about, next slide, is critically important. Government is in the business of regulating things that present risk. It's interesting, legalization to restrict access. There's this cognitive dissonance that seems to kind of happen when people hear the phrase. But the reality is it's kind of what we do as governments. We identify substances, products of any kinds. They present some risks, and regulations then ensue to create some type of system of safeguards. The other thing that's not actually on the slide, but the other thing that's really important, and I might kind of come back to this at several points, and those of you who are subject to my rants in private will know that I think context is really important. There's a context around cannabis and the risks and the potential benefits, and that's really, really important. It's very diverse in Canada. The sort of norms around cannabis use and conversations and understanding that exist in certain parts of this country do not exist in other parts of this country. And I would say that when we talk about the control framework, it's equally important to remember that when we think about this globally, that the Canadian view of cannabis and how we're proceeding is unique. Many have observed that we'll be the first G7 country, the first OECD member to do this. I mean, really, it's Uruguay and Uruguay alone who have sought to legalize and regulate cannabis, and it's often said that Canada, in undertaking this approach, is a completely different. It's a completely different thing. That context really, really matters when we start thinking about the evolution of the system that we're looking to kind of put on board. So, back to public health. So we've talked a little bit about the policy imperative. And then let's talk a little bit about, we'll sort of unpack that. So what is the government trying to achieve through its new proposals? So certainly looking to shift from exclusively relying on criminalization as a deterrent and moving to a conversation about the minimization of of harms and risks through a variety of different interventions. And you see those. And for those of you who are familiar with, say, for instance, tobacco control, the language starts to resemble one another, right? So there are interventions that need to happen that are simply about education. We talked a little bit about that already, about raising awareness and building, again, a fact base that, whether it's from a consumer perspective or a non-consumer perspective, it can be trusted and relied upon. Certainly we want to prevent problematic use and minimize harms associated with problematic use, and frankly, in doing that, promote healthy choices. The third one really speaks to the regulatory dimension of the strategy, which is really around protections. And the final one, I think, it's perhaps the least, I don't know if it's the least exciting, but it's certainly one that gets talked about the least. The need to monitor very, very closely the intended and unintended effects of all of these changes, and commit to a certain level of transparency and reporting, such that we can adjust the system over time and be able to really, really measure the impact. So the next slide, kind of warms the cockles of my federal regulatory heart. So Canada's good at two things, right? We're really, like, our national identity seems to be defined by hockey and regulations. So let's talk a little bit about regulations. So there's a bunch of different elements, a bunch of different instruments, characteristics, however you want to call it, that we will deploy to achieve the goals that we've just set out. So this slide takes a 140-page piece of legislation. Oh, next slide, please. And tries to kind of distill it a little bit. So one of the instruments we rely upon to achieve those objectives is the legislation. So Bill C-45, it's in front of the Senate, if you didn't know that. And what does it try to do? Well, it has a number of measures that look to restrict access to young people. Perhaps the most obvious one is with respect to setting a minimum age. You will all likely know that provinces and territories are afforded a certain amount of flexibility in defining certain characteristics at the local level, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. It also provides for a number of controls with respect to adult access, a possession limit, an allowance for home cultivation, but within parameters. Certainly, it provides a number of authorities for government to provide direct oversight over the operations of a legal regulated industry. And again, I'll get into that in just a moment. And then finally, and this is really an important part of the conversation, and to me, it speaks to my point about the global and the Canadian context. We're talking about a series of activities that are permitted with rules, as I've just kind of foreshadowed, and yet implicit in that is that there are activities that remain prohibited. And so one of the and Mark can correct me here, but one of the things the task force heard and then relayed to government quite clearly was the integrity of the new set of rules and the new system that's being created in large part rests upon that they're enforced, and that the red lines that are drawn don't get crossed, and so there are activities that remain prohibited, and those are set in the Act. So, looking on to the next slide, kind of takes us into the world of regulatory instruments. And I think there's two slides here that I'll try to get through relatively quickly. For those of you who are really, really interested in this, and I'm sure it's every single one of you, we published a couple of papers, one in November and one a couple of weeks ago, that set out a certain amount of detail around what the regulatory proposals will be. So if you're really deeply interested in understanding things like what will be the licensing framework, what are the rules around the production practices, reporting requirements, security, these sorts of things, they're described in a certain amount of detail in those policy papers. But the slide kind of summarizes some of the key elements. The idea, and this is where someone in the room is thinking, well, that public health thing is great, but the other kind of objective set out in the legislation is to enable the development of a market that will, frankly, over time, displace the very kind of large and complex illegal market that exists today. And sometimes those two policy imperatives, there's some tension, and then they rub up against one another. So part of what we've done in designing the regulations is, of course, keep public health top of mind, but then also look to design the regulations in such a way that we can encourage the development of a diverse and competitive industry. And so I won't really go into it in a lot of detail, but I will just say a few things. So we're imagining creating a pathway, a series of pathways for people and companies, to be frank, who want to engage in the legal industry. And this is a fairly textured licensing proposal whereby the type of license is tailored to the activity that the company wants to do. And there are some new activities that are not currently permitted today. A nursery license, licenses that are defined by the scale of the enterprise that someone is looking to do. So a micro versus a large scale enterprise. And I think importantly for many of you, a much clearer, well, maybe John Page is in the room and he can sort of speak up here, but a much clearer pathway to be able to conduct research, analytical testing, and really look to streamline and make much more accessible the necessary permissions to conduct those activities, recognizing that today it can be mildly Kafkian. The other thing that I would want to talk a little bit about, given the topic of the next 2 days, is just to make it very clear that access to cannabis for medical purposes remains a predominant interest of the government. We certainly understand the responsibilities and the obligations that we have. We also understand that the period of transition that we're entering, and frankly that we're in the midst of, like all transitions, will be difficult at times. And so not only do we want to maintain the existing pathways that exist today throughout the transition period and beyond, but frankly we are looking, and if you are interested in this, a bit of detail is included in both the papers I mentioned earlier, looking at ways to create new or to tailor existing pathways to encourage the development of cannabis-based medicines, whereby we have a much more diverse series of doors to consider from a patient perspective. We have heard from patients directly, from patient advocates, that there is a deep concern about what legalization will look. Will it erode the system that exists today and the access points? Will it compromise access in a whole variety of different ways? Certainly a lot of conversation around coverage for insurance purposes and reimbursement. The taxation issue, of course, was a very difficult one as well. So there's a whole constellation of issues that sort of center around what to do in order to ensure access is maintained, and then how to continue to improve it going forward. So I just wanted to acknowledge that that's an important part, and even though it's not the centerpiece of my presentation, it's not because it's not top of mind. Let's see, if we go to the next slide. So in a couple of minutes, I'll talk a little bit about what's happening at the provincial and territorial level. But before I get there, just to make it really clear, so the proposal that exists right now is really a cooperative system whereby there would be a national system whereby standards and rules are established around the development of cannabis products, so that a consumer in the Yukon enjoys the same protections around the composition, the nature of the product as somebody who lives in PEI. And that standardization across the country is really exists because of the public health interest. I think in the interest of time, I'll just kind of skip on to the next slide. I mentioned earlier in the opening that the team at Health Canada, in many ways over the last couple of years, has been occupying this role of like designer, architect of all of these various new pieces in support of the government. But frankly, that role of that designer architect is going to evolve into something that's probably more akin to like a building superintendent. And our responsibilities will be to ensure oversight and promote compliance with the regulations. And our operations will become much more like what you see in other federal or other regulatory organizations. And there's a bunch of different ways that we will execute those responsibilities, and they're described a little bit on this slide. And again, if you're really interested, they're described in the paper. So we have a series of instruments that we can use to ensure compliance, to monitor compliance, to enforce the rules. On the next slide, kind of takes us a little bit out of the regulatory environment, but again, it's got a key feature of that public health approach I mentioned off the top. So you kind of heard me go on about the importance of education, and so the next couple of slides really sort of make that case, the need for balanced, neutral, non-judgmental, evidence-based or evidence-informed information on the health effects. And so governments do what governments do. There are, sort of national campaigns and these sorts of things that are, and you see a few examples of those set out on the slide, and if there's any interest, I'd be happy to elaborate on those. But I think on the next slide, the piece that I really wanted to draw your attention to is that it's not just about those things. And so it's also about supporting non-governmental organizations, community-based organizations. The recent budget had $62 million that were dedicated specifically to be able to support local, provincial, Indigenous, other organizations to engage in dialogue and really to start to create that basis of information. And there's a little bit of that described in the slide here. The other thing I wanted to acknowledge is really the conversation about Indigenous perspectives with respect to cannabis legalization. This has been a really kind of critical component of getting to where we are at today. We have, and I was happy to see representatives from the Assembly of First Nations and other representatives here attending in this session today, and I think that's fantastic. There's a tremendous amount of interest that we hear about coming from communities, from regional organizations, from national organizations, and the interest is really quite as varied as it is in non-Indigenous communities. Concerns about whether this is the right thing to do. Will this actually make a problem that exists worse, or will it actually improve things? What are the economic opportunities that come with this, and how can they be accessed, if you will? And certainly questions of governance and rulemaking, and there's a very, very rich conversation that's happening in Indigenous communities regarding cannabis legalization, and I really just wanted to acknowledge that. And it's something that my team is very, very heavily involved in trying to be accessible and available to answer questions and provide other supports that I'd be happy to describe later if there's interest. The next slide really just kind of provides a bit more detail regarding the monitoring that I described earlier, and really this is the place where where I say something like every so many newspaper articles and so many meetings that we go to, somebody speaks up and says, hey, the world is watching Canada. So we have a duty, we have an obligation to be able to tell Canada's story in a fact-based way to the world. And so there are a number of initiatives underway that will help us define a baseline of data, measure against that baseline going forward, and be able to tell that story, as it were. My colleague Hanan will do a presentation, I think, a little later this morning, and he'll provide you a bit of insight into one of the tools that we deployed to assist in those monitoring activities. I also want to draw your attention to the fact that Stats Canada is really, really heavily involved right now in the data collection space, in the monitoring. They're doing all sorts of really, really creative things with crowdsourcing data and these sort. They've actually created a cannabis statistics hub. If you're not aware of it and you're into these things, it's pretty cool. You should check it out. So a couple of slides, moving ahead here, because I want to try to be respectful of everyone's time. So I've spent most of my time talking about federal actions. All the stuff I just told you about is stuff that's almost entirely in the federal domain. The reality is this is for this system to work, it really is something where all levels of government have to be working together. All provinces and territories, and I think, again, one more slide. Yeah, and one more after that. So the framework that's set out in C45, it intentionally promotes diversity in certain areas, and specifically diversity when it comes to retail and distribution. And so there are, and you'll see here if you can read it, I know it's a bit small, there are a number of areas where the legislation is specifically provides an ability for provincial and territorial governments to add additional restrictions in certain areas. Again, the minimum age is usually the best expression of that. And really what we've seen in all instances is provinces and territories align minimum age of purchase for cannabis with that which exists for alcohol. But you also see examples of where provincial governments or even local governments are defining rules around home cultivation. Certainly, you'll see an increasing amount of action when it comes to rules around places of consumption. Many extend rules that exist today with respect to tobacco smoke to now include cannabis smoke as well, and these sorts of things. So the system was designed to, at a national level, create coherence around the development of the product, and then at a more local level, allow for some tailoring and some flexibility to account for the local circumstances. The next slide really is just a sort of a visual representation of what that diversity looks like. You see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 provinces have introduced legislation. 3 more have passed their legislation. All of the others have set out clear policies that describe the systems that they're looking to put in place. You see different approaches. Some are relying, like in the province that we're in right now, some of them are relying entirely on crown corporations, kind of government-run agencies that will operate the retail environments, again, consistent with how alcohol is distributed in the province. Others are doing blended models, like with BC. And in other instances, they're relying much more heavily on simply a licensed private sector model. So you see a kind of natural differentiation. And so it will be, if we think about the monitoring comment earlier, it will be interesting as a part of the exercise of monitoring and evaluating to understand how the different models do or do not achieve the outcomes that we're looking to achieve in a better way. So last slide, Mark's given me the 1-minute warning, is everybody's favorite question. So when's this going to happen? It's funny, I was going to say that everyone's second favorite question that I get asked is like, how many joints can you roll with 30 grams? But I didn't put that in the slide. Anyway. So, okay, so this is our best effort. Right? Oh, next slide, please. So here's what we know. And here's where we've been a little bit, and here's what we think lies ahead. So it's been a journey. That's maybe a bit of an understatement, but so of course you have the task force and the work that they accomplished, the introduction of the bill. The bill remains before Parliament. You have the concurrent development of regulatory proposals, and largely that's because when the bill comes into force, there need to be regulations in place simultaneously. So we've adopted a unique approach to the development of the regulations. But really, I think what most people are interested in is what happens next. What does the next year look like, or what does the next number of months look like? And the reality is it's impossible for anyone to say with any certainty. We know that the Senate has agreed to a timetable. I'm sure many of you are aware of this. They've agreed to do their final vote on no later than June 7th. The government has said for quite some time now that its intention is to bring the system into force in the summer. Provinces and territories specifically have asked the government for some period of transition that would exist between the period where Parliament provides royal assent and when it comes into force, so when the lights get turned on. The government has not responded formally as to what that transition period will be. But nevertheless, you see on the far right of the spectrum, the blue kind of ish boxes, you see an anticipation that the Senate will conduct their activities in early June, that following that, Parliament will have final votes on the bill and provide royal assent. I don't show this because I have any guarantee that that will happen, but that is our best assumption of what the next steps are. And then the final box is simply an acknowledgement that there's a certain phasing of the rollout of this exercise. So you may or may not be aware that in the first instance, there'll be a certain limited range of cannabis products that are made legal, and then a greater diversity of products, edibles and cannabis in other forms, would then follow 12 months later. And largely this is owing to the fact that developing regulations for these other products is an order of magnitude more complex. The bill has been amended. It was amended by the Health Committee to create a clock, if you will, of 12 months for that process to occur. And so that's what's reflected in that final box. So Mark has been very patient with me. And so in closing, so next slide, please. I would be remiss if I didn't kind of characterize this as a historic and I think deceptively complex undertaking. It's one that has deep, deep cultural and emotional positions that need to be thought through and worked through. It is, I think my favorite thing that Mr. Blair says about this file is that this is a process, it's not an event. And I think that's actually a very, very helpful paradigm as we contemplate taking this next step along a long road that we're on right now. So the last slide is how to reach us. I've said it before, I guess I should say it again. We've got the coolest email address in government. Feel free to use it. And I will be around for a little while. I'm happy to take some questions now, I think, Mark, if I haven't burned up all my time. And if we don't have time for all the questions, I'm going to be around, so if folks want to talk to me on the breaks and stuff, that would be awesome. So thanks very much.